They're right on time." Marcus Ellison didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't stand. He didn't glance toward the hallway with surprise. He simply closed the leather folder in front of him and folded his hands on the polished walnut table as though the next few minutes had been scheduled weeks ago. The boardroom fell silent. At precisely 9:04 a.m., the double doors at the far end of Ellison Dynamics headquarters swung open. 3 federal agents entered in dark business suits, their identification badges hanging openly from their jackets. Their measured footsteps echoed across the spacious room, replacing the quiet hum of conversation with a tension so heavy that even the city's skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to fade into the background. Every head turned. Every eye followed them. Except Marcus. He remained seated at the head of the conference table, calm enough to make the silence feel even louder. Richard Coleman couldn't hide the smile forming at the corner of his mouth. For months, the white chief operating officer had waited for this moment. He leaned back comfortably in his chair, crossing one leg over the other as if watching the final act of a play whose ending he already knew. "I guess today's agenda just changed," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. A few members of the board exchanged uneasy looks. Someone quietly closed a laptop. Another director lowered his coffee cup without taking a sip. No one knew why federal agents had entered one of the company's most important quarterly meetings. But everyone assumed the same thing. Someone was about to be investigated. Richard looked directly at Marcus. "You've been unusually confident lately," he said with a faint smile. "Maybe now we'll understand why." Marcus met his gaze without the slightest hint of irritation. "Maybe you will." The answer unsettled more people than any denial could have. At the opposite end of the table, corporate counsel adjusted her glasses, instinctively reaching for a legal pad. 2 vice presidents avoided looking at Marcus altogether. One independent board member slowly exhaled, already imagining the headlines that could destroy years of growth in a single afternoon. The lead federal agent stopped just inside the room. His expression revealed nothing. Professional. Controlled. He briefly scanned every face around the table before resting his attention on Marcus. For a heartbeat, neither man spoke. Then Marcus gave a small nod. "Good morning, Agent Dawson." Several people turned sharply toward him. Richard's smile faltered for the first time. The CEO knew the agent's name. Agent Dawson acknowledged him with the slightest inclination of his head. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison." That simple exchange transformed the atmosphere. This no longer felt like strangers arriving unexpectedly. It felt like 2 people continuing a conversation that had begun long before anyone else entered the room. Richard straightened in his chair. "You know each other?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the clock mounted on the boardroom wall. 9:05, exactly as planned. Outside the glass windows, the financial district bustled with another ordinary workday. Inside, however, every heartbeat seemed to grow louder than the last. The board chair finally cleared his throat. "Agent Dawson, may I ask the purpose of this visit?" Before the agent could respond, Richard spoke over him. "If this concerns executive misconduct," he said carefully, "the board is fully prepared to cooperate." Several directors nodded almost instinctively. Marcus remained perfectly still. He neither objected nor defended himself. He simply watched Richard with the quiet patience of someone waiting for a carefully constructed trap to close on its own. Agent Dawson reached into the leather portfolio he carried under one arm. The sound of the metal clasp clicking open echoed through the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard's confident smile slowly returned. He was certain the next document would end Marcus Ellison's career. Marcus, however, had been waiting all morning for that portfolio to open. Agent Dawson didn't remove a badge. He removed a sealed manila envelope. Every eye followed it as he placed it carefully on the conference table. No one reached for it. The silence became almost physical. Richard Coleman was the first to break it. "If this concerns the CEO," he said smoothly, "the board deserves to hear it immediately." His confidence seemed to reassure several directors. A few straightened their posture, preparing for the corporate disaster they believed was moments away. Marcus Ellison remained motionless. His hands rested calmly on the table. No tapping fingers. No nervous glance. No whispered conversation with legal counsel. Only patience. Across the room, General Counsel Linda Hayes watched him closely. During 3 years of working beside Marcus, she had seen him negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions, survive hostile shareholder meetings, and navigate public crises without once allowing emotion to dictate his decisions. This morning felt different. Not because he looked worried. Because he looked prepared. Agent Dawson glanced toward the board chair. "With your permission, we'd like to proceed." The chairman nodded cautiously. "Please." Before opening the envelope, Dawson surveyed the room once more. "We appreciate everyone's cooperation. Our presence today is related to an ongoing federal investigation." A quiet murmur spread around the table. Richard folded his hands together. "As I said," he replied, "the company is fully committed to transparency." Marcus looked at him briefly. The expression wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't anger. It was the calm observation of a man watching someone unknowingly walk deeper into a carefully marked path. Richard noticed the look. "You seem remarkably comfortable," he said. Marcus answered without hesitation. "I've had a long morning." Several board members exchanged puzzled glances. The meeting had only begun. How could it already have been a long morning? Outside, the elevators continued carrying employees to their offices. Through the glass walls, assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying reports and coffee trays, completely unaware that the executive floor had fallen into absolute stillness. Inside, Agent Dawson finally broke the seal. He removed several folders, each marked with official evidence labels. No names were visible. Only numbered tabs. Another agent quietly connected a government-issued laptop to the conference room display. The large screen remained black. Waiting. Richard's confidence only grew. "This must involve financial reporting," he suggested. "No." "Procurement?" "No." His smile weakened slightly. "Then perhaps executive compliance?" Agent Dawson offered no explanation. Instead, he arranged the folders with meticulous precision, as though every document had its exact place in a sequence that could not be disturbed. Marcus glanced once at the digital clock. 9:09, 4 minutes behind schedule. He looked toward Agent Dawson. "Traffic." A faint smile crossed the agent's face. "Construction on 5th Avenue. "I figured." That brief exchange landed like a stone in still water. Richard's expression tightened. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't an unexpected investigation. Marcus knew exactly when the agents were supposed to arrive. He even knew they were late. The realization spread slowly across the room. Questions replaced assumptions. One independent director leaned forward. "Mr. Ellison?" His voice was careful now. "Were you expecting federal agents before this meeting started?" Marcus met the question with the same quiet composure he had shown since the doors first opened. "I asked everyone to be here at 9 o'clock, he said evenly. Then he looked toward Agent Dawson. "I asked them to be here at 9 as well." No one spoke. Richard stared at Marcus, the certainty that had carried him through the morning beginning to fracture for the very first time. No one reached for the evidence folders. The boardroom had transformed from a place of quarterly reports and financial projections into something far more unsettling, a room where every glance carried suspicion. Richard Coleman forced a measured smile. "If you invited federal agents into this meeting," he said, "perhaps you'd like to explain why." Marcus folded his hands again. "Not yet." The answer was maddeningly simple. Richard leaned forward. "Not yet. There will be time." The words landed with frustrating calm. Several board members shifted uneasily in their seats. The silence no longer favored Richard. It had begun to favor the man who seemed least interested in controlling it. Board Chair Eleanor Whitmore finally spoke. "Marcus, this board deserves some clarity." "You'll have it." "When?" Marcus glanced toward Agent Dawson. "When they're ready." Richard let out a short laugh. "So we're supposed to sit here while federal agents dictate our meeting?" "No," Marcus replied. "They're here because facts dictate outcomes." Richard's smile disappeared. Across the room, Agent Dawson remained focused on arranging the files. Beside him, another agent connected an encrypted drive to the conference room display. A loading symbol briefly appeared before disappearing into a secure login screen. No presentation began. Not yet. The waiting seemed intentional. Richard stood. "If there are allegations against executive leadership, we shouldn't waste the board's time." He looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with each director. "I move that we temporarily suspend Mr. Ellison's authority pending the outcome of this investigation." The words hung heavily in the air. A vice president slowly nodded. Another director exchanged uncertain glances with corporate counsel. Someone quietly whispered, "That may be the safest course." Marcus remained seated. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. His composure made the proposal feel strangely incomplete. Eleanor looked toward him. "Marcus, do you wish to respond before the board considers the motion?" He answered almost immediately. "No." Richard blinked. "No? I'd rather everyone hear everything first." The confidence in his voice unsettled even those who had silently agreed with Richard only moments earlier. General Counsel Linda Hayes studied Marcus carefully. She had prepared for legal challenges before. She had prepared for hostile acquisitions. She had never seen a CEO willingly allow a motion to suspend his own authority without offering the smallest defense. Unless he already knew the vote would never happen. The thought sent an unexpected chill through her. Richard sensed hesitation spreading across the room and quickly pressed forward. "The integrity of this company is bigger than one individual." Marcus looked directly at him. "On that, we agree." For a split second, Richard looked almost satisfied. Then Agent Dawson spoke for the first time in several minutes. "Mr. Coleman." Richard turned. "Yes?" "We'd appreciate it if no one leaves the room until we're finished." Richard frowned. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." The single word carried an authority no one questioned. Another agent placed a small evidence box beside the folders. The sound of cardboard touching polished wood echoed through the silent room. Richard's eyes briefly drifted toward the box. It was subtle. Barely noticeable. But Marcus noticed. So did Agent Dawson. Marcus lowered his eyes to the digital clock. 9:13, then, almost as if he were confirming the final piece of a carefully timed sequence, he quietly said, "Everything should be in place now." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the conference room doors opened once again. This time, 2 additional federal agents entered carrying sealed evidence cases and a compact rolling cart labeled with official forensic equipment. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no routine visit. This looked like the beginning of an operation. The rolling cart came to a stop beside the conference table. Inside its locked compartments were evidence sleeves, digital storage containers, tamper-proof seals, and portable forensic scanners. The agents moved with quiet efficiency, speaking only when necessary, each action practiced enough to suggest they had rehearsed this sequence many times before. No one in the room reached for a phone. No one dared interrupt. Richard Coleman finally broke the silence. "This is excessive." Agent Dawson looked at him calmly. "No, Mr. Coleman." He placed a thin folder on the table. "This is procedure." Richard forced a laugh that sounded weaker than before. "You still haven't told us what this investigation is about." "We will." "When?" "When everyone who needs to hear it is present." Richard frowned. Who exactly are we waiting for? Before Dawson could answer, the boardroom doors opened once more. Marcus's executive assistant, Natalie Brooks, stepped inside carrying a small locked document case. She walked directly toward Marcus. No hesitation. No uncertainty. I have everything you requested. Marcus accepted the case with a simple nod. Thank you, Natalie. She quietly left the room without looking at anyone else. Several directors exchanged puzzled glances. Richard watched the document case settle onto the table. You've certainly planned quite a performance. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the case. I planned for the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. Agent Dawson turned toward the board. Over the past 8 months, multiple federal agencies have conducted a confidential investigation involving procurement practices, contract awards, financial irregularities, and internal discrimination complaints connected to this corporation. The room became perfectly still. Not one person shifted in a chair. Not one keyboard clicked. Richard's expression hardened. Connected to the corporation? Correct. And you chose today's board meeting. We did. Richard immediately looked toward Marcus. So you've been cooperating? Marcus answered without emotion. I've been complying with the law. Those words landed differently. Not defensive. Not proud. Simply factual. One independent director leaned forward. Mr. Ellison, when did you first become involved? Marcus looked briefly toward the windows overlooking the city. 8 months ago. Several board members stared at him. 8 months. Long before today's meeting. Long before the rumors. Long before anyone suspected federal involvement. Corporate counsel Linda Hayes slowly lowered the pen she had been holding. Every unusual decision Marcus had made during the past year suddenly began fitting together. Delayed contract approvals. Independent compliance reviews. Unexpected audits. Restricted document access. At the time, many executives had complained that he was slowing the company down. Now those same decisions looked less like caution and more like preparation. Richard noticed the change spreading across the room. He stepped forward. If you've been secretly working with federal investigators for 8 months, why didn't you inform executive leadership? Marcus finally met his eyes. Because executive leadership was part of what needed to be verified. The sentence struck the room with startling force. Richard's face lost its color for the briefest moment. Only the briefest. Then he recovered. That's an extraordinary accusation. Marcus gently slid the locked document case toward Agent Dawson. I haven't accused anyone. The agent entered a numeric code. The locks clicked open. Inside were neatly organized binders, encrypted storage drives, signed witness statements, and a stack of sealed evidence envelopes, each labeled with dates spanning nearly 8 months. Agent Dawson carefully lifted the first envelope. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked around the boardroom, making eye contact with every director before stopping at Richard Coleman. Then, in the same calm tone he had maintained since entering the building, he spoke words that caused the temperature in the room to seem to drop. Mr. Coleman. He paused just long enough for every heartbeat in the room to become audible. The evidence we're about to present was collected with the full cooperation of Mr. Marcus Ellison. Richard's confident posture finally cracked. For the first time that morning, he realized the investigation had never been circling Marcus. It had been quietly circling the people sitting beside him. No one spoke after Agent Dawson's final sentence. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to realization. Richard Coleman looked around the conference table, searching for reassurance that was no longer there. Directors who had eagerly supported his motion only minutes earlier now avoided his eyes. Even those who had privately questioned Marcus seemed frozen, unwilling to interrupt what was clearly unfolding according to a plan far older than today's meeting. Agent Dawson carefully opened the first evidence envelope. Inside was a thin stack of printed emails. He handed copies to the board chair and corporate counsel before placing another set beneath the document camera. The conference room screen illuminated for the first time. A series of emails appeared. Names. Dates. Approval chains. Vendor contracts. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Until one sentence was highlighted in yellow. Keep Marcus out of the review. He'll ask too many questions. No one breathed. Richard stared at the screen. That proves nothing. Agent Dawson calmly pressed a key. Another email replaced the first. Then another. Each one built upon the last. Discussions about steering contracts. Instructions to bypass compliance reviews. Private conversations about destroying draft reports before quarterly audits. Every document carried verified metadata. Timestamps. Corporate servers. Digital signatures. None of it could easily be dismissed. Richard leaned forward. These emails could have been taken out of context. Marcus remained silent. He didn't look at the screen. He looked only at the board members as their expression slowly changed from skepticism to disbelief. Agent Dawson nodded toward another federal agent. Display Exhibit 12. The screen faded briefly before security footage appeared. A timestamp in the corner showed 6 months earlier. The Executive Procurement Office. Richard entered carrying a folder. Moments later, another executive followed. The audio was clear. Marcus can't see these numbers. We'll route them through the consulting account. No audit until after the acquisition. The recording ended. No commentary followed. None was necessary. Richard's face tightened. That's only part of the conversation. It is, Agent Dawson agreed. Which is why we have the complete recording. He placed another storage drive beside the laptop. Richard's confidence fractured visibly. For the first time, he looked toward Marcus instead of the board. You've been recording us? Marcus answered quietly. No. I authorized the preservation of evidence after multiple internal complaints reached my office. Richard shook his head. So this whole time, Marcus interrupted gently, I was trying to determine whether the complaints were isolated or systemic. The room fell silent again. Board Chair Eleanor Whitmore slowly removed her glasses. Marcus. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You already knew. I suspected. And today? Marcus finally looked toward Agent Dawson. Today was the day suspicion became proof. Before anyone could respond, Agent Dawson reached into the final evidence envelope. Instead of another document, he removed several folded sheets stamped with an official federal seal. He laid them carefully on the table. The top page faced Richard. Across the header, in bold letters, were the words, Federal Search Warrant. Richard's eyes widened. Agent Dawson's voice remained steady. Mr. Coleman, before this meeting continues, I need you to understand that these warrants authorize the immediate seizure of corporate records, electronic devices, and offices associated with individuals named in this investigation. Richard swallowed. And who exactly is named? Agent Dawson held his gaze for one long, unwavering moment. Then he lowered the warrant onto the polished table directly in front of him. You are. Richard Coleman didn't touch the warrant. For several long seconds, he simply stared at his own name printed beneath the federal court seal, as though refusing to accept that ink on paper could dismantle everything he had spent years building. Around the conference table, no one moved. The confidence that had filled the room less than 15 minutes earlier had completely evaporated. Agent Dawson spoke with measured precision. Mr. Coleman, effective immediately, you are instructed not to access any corporate devices, communicate with potential witnesses regarding this investigation, or remove any company property. Richard slowly looked up. This is absurd. His voice lacked the certainty it had carried all morning. You've built this entire case around selective documents. No, Dawson replied evenly. We built it around corroborated evidence. Another agent stepped forward carrying a secure evidence bag. Mr. Coleman, your company phone, please. Richard instinctively placed a hand over the phone lying beside his notebook. You don't have the right, the warrant does. The interruption was calm. Not aggressive. Simply final. Across the table, board chair Eleanor Whitmore closed the binder containing the quarterly agenda. No one cared about revenue projections anymore. The meeting everyone had prepared for no longer existed. Corporate counsel Linda Hayes quietly stood. Mr. Coleman, she said, maintaining her professionalism, I strongly recommend you comply. Richard looked from one familiar face to another. No one defended him. No one questioned the agents. Even the executives who had supported him minutes earlier lowered their eyes. His isolation was complete. With visible reluctance, he slid his company phone across the polished table. An agent immediately sealed it inside an evidence pouch. Another agent began cataloging the laptop in front of Richard. Each item received an identification label. Each serial number was photographed. Every step followed an exact procedure. Marcus Ellison watched silently. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No triumph. Only the quiet exhaustion of someone who had carried an invisible burden for months. One board member finally found his voice. Marcus. The question came hesitantly. Why didn't you tell us? Marcus remained seated. Because I didn't know who I could safely tell. The honesty of the answer settled heavily across the room. For 8 months, he continued, every complaint, every irregular contract, every anonymous report pointed toward a pattern. He paused. But patterns aren't proof. His eyes briefly met Eleanor's. So I requested an independent investigation instead of making accusations. Agent Dawson nodded almost imperceptibly. Mr. Ellison provided access to records, authorized preservation of digital evidence, and instructed employees not to interfere with federal requests. Richard let out a bitter laugh. So all those compliance reviews were real. The surprise audits were real. The procurement delays were necessary. Each answer arrived without emotion. Each one dismantled another piece of Richard's narrative. Another federal agent approached the conference room display. We have one final item. The screen illuminated again. Not with emails. Not with financial records. A timeline appeared. Month after month. Complaint after complaint. Audit after audit. Every event connected by carefully documented evidence. Near the bottom of the timeline was today's date. Beside it appeared a single entry. Board meeting, coordinated federal execution. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. This meeting, Marcus finished the thought quietly, was never arranged to expose you. Richard frowned. Marcus's voice remained calm. It was arranged to protect the company once the evidence was complete. The distinction struck everyone in the room. Marcus had not spent months planning revenge. He had spent months ensuring that when the truth finally emerged, it would be undeniable, lawful, and strong enough to survive every challenge. Agent Dawson closed the final evidence folder. Mr. Coleman, he said, we'll now ask you to accompany us to complete the next stage of this investigation. For the first time that morning, Richard said nothing. He simply stood, looked once across the boardroom at Marcus Ellison, and realized the man he had underestimated had never been waiting for justice to arrive. He had been quietly building it. Richard Coleman rose slowly from his chair. The movement felt heavier than anyone expected, as though the weight pressing on his shoulders had nothing to do with the federal warrant and everything to do with the months of deception that had finally reached their end. One federal agent stepped beside him. Another waited quietly near the conference room door. No handcuffs. No dramatic commands. Only the unmistakable authority of a legal process already in motion. Richard looked around the boardroom one final time. The executives who had once laughed at Marcus's questions now sat in complete silence. Several avoided eye contact altogether. Others stared at the evidence spread across the table, replaying countless meetings in their minds and realizing how often they had mistaken patience for weakness. Richard's eyes finally settled on Marcus. "You planned every minute of this." Marcus remained seated. "No. I planned to protect this company. By destroying me." Marcus shook his head. "You destroyed your own position the moment you believed accountability didn't apply to you." The words landed without anger. That made them impossible to dismiss. Richard looked away. For the first time since entering the room, Agent Dawson addressed the board instead of the investigation. "We understand today's events are difficult." His voice remained steady. "Our responsibility is to establish facts, not assumptions." He paused before continuing. "The evidence presented today includes financial records, authenticated communications, witness testimony, and forensic analysis collected over several months. The investigation followed federal procedure from beginning to end. The distinction mattered. This was not a personal conflict. It was the conclusion of a lawful investigation." Eleanor Whitmore slowly stood. As chair of the board, she said, "I want today's minutes to reflect that, Mr. Marcus Ellison fully cooperated with investigators and continued protecting the company's operations throughout this process." Several directors quietly nodded. One after another. The motion required no debate. It passed unanimously. Marcus lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Not out of pride. Out of relief. The burden of carrying a secret investigation while leading thousands of employees had demanded a level of restraint few people in the room had ever recognized. Richard watched the vote in silence. Months earlier, he had been certain he understood power. Now he understood responsibility instead. As the agents escorted him toward the door, he stopped walking. "I need to ask you something." Marcus looked up. Richard's voice had lost every trace of arrogance. "When did you stop trusting me?" Marcus answered after a long pause. "I never stopped trusting people." The room remained still. "I started trusting the evidence more than my assumptions." Richard closed his eyes briefly. There was nothing left to argue. No clever explanation. No speech capable of changing what the facts had already established. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before continuing toward the hallway with the agents. The conference room doors closed softly behind them. For several seconds, no one inside moved. The city skyline beyond the windows looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Traffic flowed. Construction cranes turned slowly against the morning sky. People hurried along the sidewalks below, completely unaware that the future of one of the city's largest companies had changed forever behind a single set of closed doors. Eleanor finally broke the silence. "I owe you an apology, Marcus." He looked toward her. "I allowed suspicion to arrive before truth." Another director spoke quietly. "So did I." Then another. Around the table, one voice after another accepted responsibility, not because Marcus demanded it, but because the evidence had forced each of them to confront their own judgment. Marcus stood for the first time since the meeting had begun. He gathered none of the evidence. Claimed none of the credit. Instead, he looked around the room with the calm composure that had carried him through the longest morning of his career. "The investigation is over," he said quietly. "Our responsibility to this company begins again today." The conference room remained silent long after the doors closed behind Richard Coleman. It wasn't the silence of uncertainty anymore. It was the silence that follows undeniable truth. Agent Dawson gathered the remaining evidence folders with practiced care while the other federal agents completed a final inventory of the electronic devices collected under the warrant. Every evidence bag received one last verification before disappearing into secured transport cases. The investigation inside the boardroom had ended. The legal process beyond it had only begun. Board Chair Eleanor Whitmore slowly looked around the table. "The motion to suspend Mr. Ellison," she said quietly, "is hereby withdrawn." No one objected. In addition, she continued, I move that the board unanimously reaffirm Marcus Ellison as Chief Executive Officer and authorize an independent governance review to ensure this never happens again. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then one director raised a hand. Second. Another immediately followed. So do I. Within seconds, every remaining board member had voiced support. The vote was unanimous. Not because Marcus had asked for it. Because the facts no longer allowed any other conclusion. Marcus remained standing beside his chair. Thank you, he said simply. Nothing more. No speech celebrating victory. No reminder that he had been right. Only gratitude. Linda Hayes closed the legal binder that had remained open since the agents arrived. I've worked with executives for nearly 20 years, she said softly. I've never seen someone carry a federal investigation without allowing it to damage the people they were trying to protect. Marcus gave a faint smile. That was always the hardest part. Several board members looked toward him. One of them finally asked the question everyone had quietly been carrying. Weren't you afraid? Marcus considered the question before answering. Every day. The honesty surprised them. I was afraid someone innocent would be blamed. I was afraid evidence would disappear before investigators had enough. I was afraid people would mistake caution for weakness. His voice never changed. But fear isn't a reason to abandon responsibility. The room grew still once more. Eleanor slowly stood and walked toward Marcus. I judged your silence. Marcus met her eyes. Most people do. I thought you weren't defending yourself. I was defending the company. Those words settled over the room more heavily than any accusation ever had. Outside the conference room, employees continued moving through the executive floor, unaware that the leadership of the company had just been reshaped forever. Inside, Agent Dawson approached Marcus before leaving. Our work here is complete. Marcus extended his hand. Thank you for protecting the integrity of the process. Dawson shook it firmly. You protected it first. With that, the federal agents quietly departed. The doors closed behind them. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows once again, illuminating a room that somehow looked unchanged, despite everything that had happened within its walls. Marcus walked slowly to the head of the conference table. The quarterly report still waited where they had been left nearly an hour earlier. Revenue forecasts. Expansion plans. Employee initiatives. The ordinary work of leading a company. He opened the first folder. We still have a business to run. Several directors smiled for the first time that morning. One by one, laptops reopened. Notebooks were lifted. Coffee cups were picked up again. The meeting resumed, not as though nothing had happened, but with a renewed understanding that leadership is measured not by the authority to command a room, but by the courage to protect it, even when standing alone. 3 months later, the boardroom looked almost exactly the same. The walnut conference table reflected the morning sunlight. Quarterly reports were neatly arranged at every seat. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved with its usual rhythm, as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened inside those walls. Yet everyone in the room knew better. The empty chair once occupied by Richard Coleman had been replaced by a new executive chosen after an independent national search. New compliance systems had been implemented throughout the company. Anonymous reporting channels had been expanded. Every major contract now required independent review before approval. The changes weren't cosmetic. They were cultural. Marcus Ellison entered the room carrying the same worn leather portfolio he had brought on the morning the federal agents arrived. He greeted every board member individually before taking his seat. There was no ceremony. No applause. Respect no longer needed to announce itself. It had become routine. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor Whitmore stood and addressed the room. Before we adjourn, there is one final item. She looked toward Marcus. The board has unanimously approved the Ellison Leadership Initiative. Marcus raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware it had been named. Eleanor smiled gently. You weren't supposed to be. She continued. The program will provide ethics training, leadership development, and scholarship opportunities for employees across every level of the company. It exists because one person reminded us that protecting an organization begins with protecting its values. The room filled with quiet applause. Marcus accepted it with the same humility he had shown throughout the investigation. After the meeting ended, he walked alone through the headquarters lobby. Employees smiled as they passed. Warehouse supervisors nodded in greeting. Interns held elevator doors without realizing they were doing it for the company's CEO. Nothing about their respect felt forced. It had been earned. Near the entrance stood a simple glass display installed after the investigation concluded. There were no newspaper headlines celebrating Marcus. No photographs of the federal agents. No trophies. Inside the display rested a single framed statement adopted into the company's leadership principles. Visitors often stopped to read it. Employees passed it every morning. Marcus paused for only a moment before continuing toward the exit. The words reflected softly in the glass beside him. Integrity is not measured by what you do when everyone believes you. It is measured by what you protect when no one understands you. Outside, the morning air carried the sounds of traffic, construction, and ordinary life. Marcus looked across the city before walking down the front steps of the building. Months earlier, many people had mistaken his silence for fear. They had mistaken patience for weakness. They had mistaken dignity for surrender. What they failed to understand was that real leadership does not rush to win arguments. It quietly prepares for the moment when truth can stand on its own. Marcus never needed the loudest voice in the room. He never needed revenge. He never needed anyone to underestimate him. He needed only enough courage to keep doing what was right while others questioned his motives. Behind him, employees entered the building ready to begin another workday, carrying with them lessons that no quarterly report could ever measure. The federal agents had walked into one meeting. But what truly changed that morning was not a single investigation. It was an entire company's understanding of trust, accountability, and character. Because power can command attention. Authority can command obedience. But only integrity earns lasting respect.